Okay, everyone, welcome to the SEEP Avian Training video series. I'll be your instructor and co-worker for the field season, DJ McNeil, graduate student at Cornell University. Be sure to email me with any questions. If you have this video, you most likely have my email address. And another reminder, this is only a supplement to your other study and refresh tools. It should serve as a help and assistance to your other bird learning tools, but not the primary method of learning. So without further ado, let's dig into birds of prey. Okay, so it's probably worth noting that there are different groups of birds of prey that we'll be covering in this video, particularly those that you need to know for the SEEP project. We have birds of prey with relatively long, rounded wings and a short tail. These are what we call the buteos. We have this very sort of rounded wing, but they're pretty long. These birds mostly soar to hunt prey and dive down to catch it. Then we have the accipiters, which, like the buteo, has a rounded wing shape, but they have a long, thin tail, at least compared to the buteo. And the reason for this is these birds are bird hunters. So these guys use their short, rounded wings to maneuver through dense vegetation, and that long tail helps out with that as well. And the next group are the falcons, which have these very long, skinny, pointed wings and are generally quite quick, hanging out in open areas. The tail is a moderate length and not particularly long or particularly short one way or another. Now there are a number of birds that we'll cover in this talk. 2 accipiter species, 3 buteos, a single falcon, a single harrier, a single eagle, a single osprey, a single vulture, and 2 additional birds which are actually passerines that are similar in many ways to birds of prey. So getting into the particular species here, we'll start with the red-tailed hawk. Now the red-tailed hawk tends to be a pretty easy one for most people, but to give you some of the basics, the red-tailed hawk has a white breast and a white belly. Now a lot of birds of prey have white on their underparts, but these two things coupled with a band of stripes sort of across the mid-belly are very distinctive collection of features only found in the red-tailed hawk. So essentially a white breast and belly with a speckled belly band found only on the red-tailed hawk. Also a dark patagium. This area here at the front of the wing is dark, and this is only found on the red-tailed hawk, and it's always found on the red-tailed hawk, juvenile, adult, or otherwise. Here's another adult that's got this dark patagial stripe. The other characteristic of the red tail, a lot of people, in my opinion, give little value to, is this stripe on the back, this V shape. On all red-tailed hawks, when you see them from the back, they have this stripe, this V, and you can see it here on this bird on the left side has the V as well. This sort of vague, it's not a clear V, but it's always there, an indistinct light colored V. Now the red tail's a tricky one because they spend several years in their juvenile plumage. And the juvenile in many ways looks very much like the adult, but there are some differences to note. The first difference is somewhat subtle, but it's the eye color. Juvenile red-tailed hawks have a straw-colored eye, whereas the adult has that very dark, sort of chocolatey-colored eye. And the second and perhaps the most obvious difference is the tail color and pattern. The adult has that classic reddish tail with a dark tip, and the juvenile has this striped tail, this dark-colored tail with bands. There's a key thing to notice about these bands on the juvenile. The juvenile red-tailed hawk has many dark and white tail bands, not just 1 or 2. There are up to 10 or more of these stripes on the tail, and this will become important later on. So again, notice here, there's a juvenile red-tailed hawk in flight. We have this dark patagium. We have a white breast, a whitish colored belly, a dark colored band across the belly of these stripes, and this band is found on all these birds. And again, we've got a light belly, light breast, dark band on all of these birds. So those traits give it away as a red tail every time. They often have a light colored throat and a dark colored head, but not always. So here again, just to demonstrate that V, here's a kind of cartoon showing where that V is located on the bird. Here's the V on this adult red-tailed hawk, a less distinct but still present V on the juvenile. And again, in flight, we also see that V, regardless of the age of the bird. So that's the red-tailed hawk. And you'll notice that I kind of played down this classic red tail. That can often give the bird away, but on the juvenile, you won't see that, and sometimes that reddish tail can be quite a light color and not clear. Also note on the adult, we've got that very dark chocolatey eye versus the juvenile, which has that straw-colored eye. And before we move on to the next bird, the vocalization of the red-tailed hawk is also quite simple. The classic eagle-type scream you hear in the videos is only the red-tailed hawk. No other bird produces that call. The juvenile also produces some weak squeals. And know that no other bird of prey makes sounds that really resemble these in any way. The classic call that I want you to know is the typical scream. But it's also useful to know some of the other juvenile squeals. Okay, the next bird that we're going to cover is the red-shouldered hawk. The red shoulder is a pretty distinctive bird. Even when it's perched or when it's flying, really, it's not too hard. You can see on the standing bird, mind you, we're going to only cover the adults here, which are the only birds you'll really see in any number. We see adult birds have this pearly looking wing pattern. We've got a little bit of a reddish colored shoulder here and this black and white pattern on the wings. This is distinctive. Note that we have a pattern on the wings, but there's no V of any kind on the back when the bird is in flight or when it's perched. We also don't have this white breast and white belly that we had with the red tail. We have just a solid colored breast. Or potentially, if it's not solid, it'll be sort of a white and reddish speckly bark pattern, but it's never like the red tail. Another tip that can be useful at times is this white crescent on the outer wing here. And this is on adults, juveniles, whatever. We've got this light area, this crescent on the outer wing. Is pretty useful, but probably the most useful thing when you see a red-shouldered hawk in flight is you're going to notice that the tail is banded, just like a juvenile red tail, except one major thing. One major difference. The juvenile red tail has many, many stripes, as we talked about before. This guy only has two obvious white tail bands. So that'll become important here in a moment. Two obvious white tail bands, not many obvious white tail bands. But I'm going to talk about the broadwing in a moment, which only has one obvious tail band. The last thing to note about the red-shouldered hawk is the vocalization. It's another very easy bird. It literally just makes a series of loud screams. It's probably also worth noting that blue jays can produce calls of all of these birds of prey, but when they do so, they usually do it much quieter, and when they imitate red-shouldered hawks, for example, it's usually only a couple, 2 or 3 of these keers, and that's all you'd hear out of a blue jay, whereas a true red-shouldered hawk will be significantly louder and will go on for quite a while. So let's talk about the broad-winged hawk. This is another a buteo, the third buteo that we'll talk about, the third and final. And this is another pretty easy one. All 3 of the buteos are pretty straightforward. Remember, our red tail has the clean white colored breast and belly with that stripe of bands, that stripe of sort of barring across the belly. The red-shouldered hawk has that reddish colored breast and belly that's sometimes kind of streaky. This guy has this pearly brown colored breast. We notice that the breast itself is colored, unlike the red tail, which is white. but we otherwise have a sort of an earthy toned bird of prey, kind of similar to the last two. So kind of focus in on that breast color here. We've got a dark colored breast, so you know it's either a sharp or it's either a red shoulder or a broad wing. Now the wing itself is mostly just brown. This picture isn't great, but it's not showing that distinctive kind of black and white pearly color that the red shoulder has. The other thing to note here, and probably the last major thing to note, my slideshow work here, is the tail banding. We have only one white tail band on the broad-winged hawk. Even when the bird is perched, you only see a single white tail band, whereas remember on the red shoulder, we have two white tail bands. So when this bird flies overhead, like this picture here, you're going to notice kind of a generally brownish colored hawk. You might notice this dark outer layer of flight feathers. Many birds of prey can have that, and I don't like to use that. Some people find it useful. But when you see them from below, you see this single white tail band with very bold black tail bands. So those combination of traits tell it as the broad-winged hawk. Now, like the other birds of prey we've talked about, the broad-winged hawk has very distinctive calls. It's only got one call that I'm aware of, and it's the tee-tsee. A very high-pitched call, and it's very consistent. Every time you hear it, it's pretty much just like that. And you far more often hear them than you see them. Okay, so moving on to some of the non-buteo birds, we have two accipiters that we identify in this study pretty regularly, the Cooper's hawk and the sharp-shinned hawk. Now, they can be a little tricky at times, but we're going to work through and talk about how to compare them. So remember, when you see this bird, it's got a long tail, typical of an accipiter, and these short, rounded wings. In contrast to the buteo, which has long, rounded wings and a shortened tail. That bird is adapted for soaring. Now, the Cooper's hawk is the larger of these two. The sharp-shinned hawk can be up to half the size of the Cooper's hawk. And the Cooper's hawk tends to be a bird that takes fairly large bird prey. Mind you, the accipiters in general primarily feed just on other birds. So these guys are going to be feeding on cardinals, mourning doves, pigeons, things like that. So they dash through the vegetation kind of at vegetation level and just snatch unsuspecting little birds, whereas something like a buteo is going to soar overhead most of the time looking for mice and snakes and things like that. Some things to notice about the Cooper's hawk is it's got this clean gray back by and large. There's some barring on the wings, but it's pretty much a clean gray. On the underside, on the breast and belly, for the juvenile and the adult, we've got a lot of barring, very similar to a red-shouldered hawk in many ways. But unlike the buteos, this guy is mostly a grayish color. We also have a barred tail, kind of like a red shoulder, but it's very long and skinny, unlike on the buteos. Some things to notice about the the Cooper's hawk in particular, which is our big guy here. We've got this kind of sleek, tube-shaped body. This is going to be in contrast to the sharp-shinned, which has a fat little breast and a small head. This guy is like a gradual taper from sort of a sleek breast to a pretty good-sized head. We've got big legs on this bird, a nice long tail. And when we see the tail, when the bird is perched or potentially in flight, the tail is relatively rounded. So this rounded tail and this sort of tube-shaped body are pretty distinctive traits. Another thing to notice when the bird is in flight, the way the wings are held with respect to the head. So we've got this kind of flat, relatively flat leading edge on the wings, and the head sticks out a good bit. Same thing on this bird. We've got a little bit of a joint here, but it's mostly pretty flat, with the head sticking forward. This is going to be in contrast to the sharp-shinned hawk, which pulls its wings forward more. Kind of the wingtips, the wrist here, will be level with the head, at least much more so. The call of the Cooper's hawk is also very distinctive. The bird vocalizes often. We're not even going to learn the sharp-shinned hawk call, but the Cooper's hawk makes a lot of calls. So often they'll just produce a single kek or a series of keks. There's the single kek. Often during point counts, that'll be all you hear, is a single kek. And kind of the way that I ingrained that into my mind is it's a shortened version of the main song that's produced by either sex for Cooper's Hawk, which is a series of those kecks. Again, a very distinctive vocalization. So the sharp-shinned hawk looks extremely similar to our Cooper's hawk. The bird has a very gray colored back. Let's see, I accidentally skipped through my slide there. We're going to come back to the sharp-shinned in just a moment, but just a note about the size and shape. I've got another slide with the sharp-shinned on it. Basically, the things to remember about the sharp-shinned is that we've got these are sharp-shinned, male and female, Cooper's male and female. The female is always going to be slightly larger. With the sharp-shinned, we've got this wrist that sticks forward and is almost level with the head. And this is true of male and female. Notice that we've got male and female sharp-shinned hawk. These are small birds. This is a robin. For size comparison, they're robin-sized birds. They're quite small. Whereas the Cooper's hawk is noticeably bigger than a robin. In fact, here's a crow for scale. These birds are much closer to the size of a crow, and it's pretty obvious that a crow and a robin are different sizes. Also notice that on the shape we've got sort of a more gradual leading edge on the wings, where the head sticks out much more than on the sharp-shinned hawk. So going back to a direct comparison of our Cooper's hawk and sharp-shinned hawk, some of the things that I accidentally skipped on the last thing are the shape of the head. So we've got the much smaller Cooper's hawk, or much smaller sharp-shinned hawk, pardon me. Here on the left has a small head with relation to its body size. The Cooper's hawk has a much larger head with relation to its body size. Also notice the cap. This is kind of a subtle thing. The cap on the sharp-shinned hawk is gray, like a dark gray, and continues like a mullet almost, all the way down the back. For the Cooper's hawk, we've got this kind of dark cap, but it's broken. Once it goes down the back, it sort of becomes indistinct, where it's a very complete mullet on the back of the sharp-shinned hawk. So on the head, we've got a small head with a sort of mullet, and a larger head that has a broken cap. Also notice the breast. Remember I talked before that this Cooper's hawk has this sort of tube-shaped body? Well, notice we don't really have that on the sharp-shinned. It's got this fat breast that kind of sticks right out, giving it very much a shape different than the tubular Cooper's hawk. Also notice the legs. The sharp-shinned hawk has these very long, spindly toes, very skinny legs. The Cooper's hawk, while it's a very long-legged bird, has pretty fat, juicy legs in comparison. This is a very subjective characteristic. But taking all these things together, you can identify these species. And finally, not shown in the second picture, but the tail shape. We have this very squared off tail on the sharp-shinned hawk, where the Cooper's hawk, not shown, has a very rounded tail tip. Okay, so the next couple birds that we're going to talk about are actually not birds of prey at all. The American crow and the common raven are actually large songbirds. Now, the reason that I have these lumped into here is because these two birds more or less act like birds of prey. We see them flying over a lot, we hear them calling a lot, but you don't see them at close range. So these are generally birds you see in the distance. I think it's safe to say that everyone is pretty familiar with the American crow, but there's another species, the common raven, that we need to consider when we're thinking about the American crow. So the American crow is a dark-colored bird, somewhat glossy, just like the raven. And between the crow and the raven, there's nothing else that really that you would mistake them for. So the way to discern between a crow and a raven would be at least a number of things that I use. When it's in flight, we have a kind of rounded, shorter wing here on the crow, and this round tail. So those are the two primary things that I use, as well as size. So this bird is quite a bit smaller than an American crow, or excuse me, than a common raven. So we've got the small little crow with short rounded wings, short rounded tail, just all around kind of cuter. And when you see the crow perching we've got a pretty moderate-sized bill. It's large, don't get me wrong, but it's not what you would call huge. And also the throat is very slick. There aren't a whole bunch of shaggy feathers coming out of here, which is what we'll see on the raven. The call is also very easy to learn. The American crow has the typical cawing that we hear. And know that there are many different vocalizations that the crow can produce. They're all more or less some kind of caw. The species can even produce a throaty rattle. That's the American crow. The common raven is a bit less common, but still a common species in our study area. So the first thing that I look for when I see one of these birds, which they're in the family Corvidae, so they're often just called corvids. When I first see a corvid, one of the things I look for is the shape of the tail. So they say that generally speaking, the raven has a wedge-shaped tail like this one, where it essentially comes to a point or a shallow point. Now notice that I included an example of a raven here that's got a much more rounded tail. So that rule isn't steadfast, but it's a helpful one. Another thing to note is the shape of the wings. We've got very long wings with these sort of projecting primary flight feathers on the raven, whereas the crow has those short rounded wings. When you see a crow or a raven perched, the first thing I look for is generally the size. The American crow is going to be quite a bit smaller than the raven, but I also look for the bill. So this picture shows it nicely. The bill on the raven is enormous. It's just, take a look at this bird here. The bill is almost as large as the rest of the head. When we also look at the bird, if we can get a nice look at it, the feathers on the throat of a raven are very shaggy and long, which is not the case with the American crow. The call of the common raven is kind of a nasally cawing, somewhat similar to the American crow, but it tends to be nasally and more high-pitched than the crow. Perhaps even a honking. And those last ones are actually calls of fledglings. Because the common raven is such an early breeder, during the time we're doing bird surveys, we're often encountering common ravens with their fledglings, so families of these birds. And this sort of horrific screaming call is often what you'll hear in the field. So to kind of review the difference between a crow and a raven, we have the raven on the left here, and what I've done is I've kind of put these two pictures side by side as if these birds were sitting on the same branch to maybe give you an idea of the size difference. You can see that the raven is larger than the crow, but not immensely so. We can see that the raven has this really large bill that's almost the same size as the bird's head in general, where the crow's bill is not nearly as large as the bird's head. On the crow, we have short rounded wings and a rounded tail. And on the raven, we have these longer wings with these projecting primary flight feathers, and generally, 9 times out of 10, a wedge-shaped tail. Okay, so that does it for buteos, accipiters, and our two birds of prey, or our two passerines, excuse me. Now we're going to shift over to some of the miscellaneous birds of prey that we're going to talk about. The turkey vulture is a pretty common species. Most people are pretty familiar with it, but once you start learning all these other birds of prey, some of the details become a little jumbled, so it's useful to review the particular traits of a turkey vulture you want to hone in on. We're not going to talk about a vocalization for the turkey vulture because they're essentially silent for the most part. The turkey vulture is pretty easy. It's huge, for one. We've got these very long wings. And the bird is double the size of a crow or a raven. This thing is eagle size when you see it in the field. One major trait to discern a turkey vulture, which we can look at this picture and we can see, oh yeah, it's clearly a turkey vulture, but at a distance, you might not be able to tell that it's got no feathers on its head, for example. So one thing that's really useful, comparing it particularly to eagles, is eagles fly with their wings out flat out to the sides like this, and the turkey vulture holds its wings kind of swept up like this in this shallow V shape. And no other bird of prey in our area flies with this shallow V, at least that look like this. The harrier flies like this as well, but you wouldn't be likely to mix those two up. So we've got a dark bird of prey that flies with its wings in a V and silver primary and secondary flight feathers. They often hang out in trees like this and kind of bask. You can usually see that bare head, and they're much larger than ravens or crows. So the bald eagle is another one that can be pretty fun. They can be tricky at times for sure. When you see an adult bald eagle, it's pretty distinctive. There's really nothing else that looks like that. That classic mix of the white head and tail with the dark colored body is quite distinctive, but it remains as a juvenile for 3 years in various plumages. And they're actually not that bad once you get familiar with them. With different ages of bald eagle, we often have some kind of a modeling of the body. This one tends to be, or this one seems to be mostly brown with some white sort of speckling under the wings. This one has a lot of brown on it, but a lot of white here in the belly and breast area, and this one's kind of a similar situation. Things to note with the bald eagle juvenile is it's often got white in the tail, but not always, but often does, and almost always sometime between the time when it's completely brown, more or less like this one, and the time that it has a nice white head, it's going to have white on the underside of the wings. So this is a pretty distinctive thing. This bird here seems to have lost most of the white on the underside of the wings, but at this point its head is already turning considerably whiter and the tail is turning white. So we have some transition between the really young juvenile, which is mostly kind of mottled with extensive white under the wings, and the adult, which has this white head. You might be tempted to think, well, gee, that looks awful lot like a red-tailed hawk, but you think that this bird is several times the size of a red-tailed hawk. It lacks that distinctive dark patagium that the red-tailed has, as well as any kind of banding or barring anywhere on it. All of the birds of prey that we've looked at so far have some sort of banding or barring on the tail or the wings or anything like that. And the bald eagle lacks any banding or barring. Now the bald eagle produces a number of vocalizations, but they're pretty easy to learn. They do not in any way resemble the eagles you hear in the movies, which are almost always red-tailed hawks, but the eagle produces a series of weak gull-like screams. In fact, in my opinion, it sounds often like bald eagles are trying to produce calls, but nothing's actually coming out. The bald eagle is one you won't see often, but when you do, it's pretty easy to identify. So the next species, the osprey, is another pretty easy one to identify. We've got a unique set of characteristics that are not found in any other of the birds of prey. We have a white breast and belly, this dark colored back, and the head is essentially white except a dark cap and a dark eye stripe. The bird is again pretty straightforward. When you see it in flight, it has these very dark wing patches, this kind of white base to the wings of sorts, where the radius and ulna and humerus are. The forearm of the wing, if you will, is pretty much white. And another distinctive thing is the shape. We've got this heavily jointed wing. The wings tend to be kind of bent in flight. These birds are pretty much only found near water. Sometimes they can be found a little ways from water, a few miles at the most, but they really like to be near large bodies of water. The osprey also tends to be quite vocal. So a series of high-pitched whistles is very distinctive for the osprey. Or sometimes even a simple peep. Almost more songbird-like than like a bird of prey. So again, remember, we've got a striped tail, kind of like our Buteos, but we've got these very long, lanky wings with this white under area and these black wrist. Again, those mix of characteristics are distinctive of only the osprey. And remember, they're quite vocal. They tend to make a lot of calls when they're flying around. Okay, the northern harrier. These guys are really only going to be found in any number in our Great Lakes sites. We've seen them in the Appalachians, but I'm not aware of one ever being detected around one of our survey locations. It tends to be a grassland bird, and therefore it's not common in the Appalachian Mountains. Now, there's a number of different plumage characteristics we could talk about for the harrier, but I'm only going to talk about a few because it's a pretty straightforward bird. The first thing to notice is when you see one on the ground, it's got a very owl-like face. It's got this sort of these facial discs and these very striking eyes. The beak is quite small and doesn't protrude from the face much. All of these things looking more like an owl than a bird of prey, than a typical bird of prey. When we see harriers, they're not always perched. In fact, they're almost never perched, really, when you see them. But a couple things to notice. You might be tempted to think that this is an adult and this is a juvenile, but that's not strictly the case. What we have here is an adult male, which is a predominantly gray plumage, and this is an adult female, which is predominantly brown. Now, you'll notice that we've got this sort of scalloping on the wings and this kind of clean back on the male, and these mix of traits seem to be kind of confusing. In fact, we've got a striped tail, so you're probably thinking, oh my gosh, we've got another hawk with a striped tail. That's pretty confusing. But notice one distinctive thing about the harrier that no other bird of prey has. First of all, when it flies through open grassland, it has this very loose, floppy flight, almost like a gull. Really, no other bird of prey behaves in this way. But the number one thing that no other bird of prey has is a white rump. So we have this distinctive white rump on all ages and both sexes of the northern harrier. On the adult male, we do have these dark primary flight feathers. I don't think they're really as distinctive on the female, but in any case, no matter what sex or age this bird is, it's always going to have this white rump. So look for a bird of prey to be kind of flying in a lofty manner over a grassland with that distinctive white rump. We're not going to talk about vocalizations. They don't tend to make a lot of. Okay, so the last bird we're going to talk about is the American kestrel. The American kestrel is the only falcon that we encounter in any real numbers during our study. We have the typical falcon shape where we've got these long pointed wings and kind of this moderate generalist type tail. And these long pointed wings are because the bird is built for speed. These guys fly through open grasslands, and farmlands, shrublands, and catch small birds, even potentially insects and things like that. So it's a very small bird of prey. In fact, this guy is going to be about the size of a sharp-shinned hawk, really only marginally larger than a robin. So in the breeding season, these guys eat a lot of young fledgling birds, a lot of small snakes, a lot of small rodents, and a lot of insects. They're particularly fond of dragonflies. So some things to notice about the kestrel. Regardless of sex, we have a male here and a female here. Regardless of sex, we've got these distinctive sort of facial markings here. This eye marking, this malar, the auricular marking, and then this spot on the nape. This is found on both sexes. We also have kind of this blue supercilium region and a colorful crest. And we also have this kind of warm colored back on both sexes. Now, where we start to get a bit of a distinction is the male has this blue shoulder, which is lacking in the female, and the patterning on the upper part of the wing on the male tends to be spotting, and on the female we have this barring pattern. So we've got mostly the same traits on the male and the female, but they're they're discernible. The male has this blue shoulder is primarily the main way. Tends to just be more colorful all around. In flight, they're a little harder to tell, but the female has this more consistently barred tail, whereas the male has this rufous orange tail with a black terminal tail stripe. Now, the kestrel is another one that tends to be a pretty vocal bird. But fortunately, like all the birds of prey, their calls are pretty easy to remember. It's a very kind of high-pitched, but not terribly high-pitched, kitty, 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 kitty. And they make this call often. So I think that does it for the birds of prey for the SEAP Avian Training video series. Be sure to review this video as many times as you need, as well as looking over other sources that we have discussed. And be sure to send me an email if you have any questions, and happy studying.